Manqoba, some harsh words coming through then from Lord Peter Hain, really saying that banks locally should clearly have seen the signs, and for any of them to have said that they didn't see any of the signs is a complete farce.
Well, of course, that's a sentiment that we're getting from Lord Peter Hain, who says, of course, that those banks should be held responsible for their involvement and for being enablers of state capture and looting that was carried out by the Gupta family. Of course, he cited several banks, Arabile, including the Bank of Baroda, of course, which has been fingered in many of those controversial Gupta transactions, as well as the Standard Chartered Bank, which also was involved, of course, in the looting of funds and the laundering of money in the Delhi Stina project. Of course, he says, all of these banks should take responsibility because, in effect, he says they were the enablers of state capture. He says they were the ones who had the regulations, they had the ones who had the client information, who could have really brought this information to law enforcement officials. And of course, he says also there were red flags that were there at the time. There was information that was continuously suggesting that there was something untoward with the Guptas as well as their relationship with President Jacob Zuma. But he said, of course, all of these banks didn't take note of this, and in fact, they continued and they allowed for corruption and the looting of the state to occur. And he says, of course, they should be held accountable. And in fact, he says they are culpable and guilty of criminal activity associated with the Guptas. Let's take a listen, Arabil.
Banks should have access to customer data and transaction data for all the accounts they open and the transfers they facilitate, and they should be in a position to monitor the legitimacy of any of these transactions, as well as having regulatory and moral responsibilities to recognize, to stop and identify illegal money flows. But after I'd exposed the international dimension to state capture in the British Parliament, beginning in November 2017, I met senior directors of HSBC and Standard Chartered. They asked to see me because I'd referred to them in Parliament. And frankly, I found a great reluctance from both of them, citing this question of client confidentiality, which is the excuse they hide behind, to actually admit to their culpability and to cooperate fully when I specifically asked them to track the money laundered by the Guptas under former President Zuma's administration. And I find this quite unacceptable. So this is directors of banks in London simply saying, okay, we had Gupta accounts, but we closed them years ago. We're not responsible. We have no culpability. In my view, they are directly culpable for what happened in this instance.
Manqoba, well, clearly then Lord Peter Hain does make a good reference and a good point then to actually say that, well, you have all the information, you had all the specifics about these companies and where the banks, where the Guptas sort of kept their money in particular, and surely then you must hold yourselves responsible.
Well, certainly, because he says, these banks are the ones that actually opened the doors for the Guptas, the international network, for them to access that international network, of course. And he says that these banks had all the information on the Guptas, they had all the relevant, sort of like information on these activities as well, these nefarious activities that are happening, but they simply didn't do anything about it. And he says this is simply not enough and it's not acceptable, and these banks should take some sort of responsibility for this, Arabile.
Manqoba, thank you so much for it, but I will continue to check in on you, of course, across the day as that state capture inquiry continues. Lord Peter Hain on the stand there, former MP then, of course, out in the United Kingdom, on the stand at that state capture inquiry happening out in Parktown. Our colleague Manqoba